来宾午安，欢迎参加这场由外交部主办、中华民国对外贸易发展协会以及台湾欧银业务发展办事处共同执行的经济稳定成长之路演讲会。Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's event of the Road to Economic Stability and Growth, a European Perspective. 在活动正式开始之前，让我先跟各位来宾介绍今天与会的贵宾。首先是执行单位外贸协会赵永全秘书长。紧接着是今天活动的引言人，台湾银行张秀莲董事长。And today's speaker, Dr. Thomas Miro, President of European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. 现在让我们邀请外贸协会赵永全秘书长来为我们致辞，欢迎赵秘书长。
我们的主办单位外交部理事长 Dr. Thomas Miro, President Chiang, and we have so many guests. We have Ambassador Guibu, Ambassador Tapia, Ambassador Ngele, and we have some representatives, Mr. Vine, Mr. Kodeka, Mr. Krupa, Mr. Fear, and Mr. Dacho， 当然我们还有国内的贵宾，捷邦公司的赵董事长，还有施总理事。Distinguished guests from European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. On behalf of Taiwan External Trade Development Council, first, let me welcome Dr. Thomas Miro to come to Taipei. I understand this is the first trip to Taipei for Dr. Miro. And I hope the hospitality that all Taiwan people offer can leave a long-lasting warm memory with you. At the same time, I would also like to take the chance to welcome all audience from various industries to join us today for this opportunity to Dr. Miro's speech, The Road to Economic Stability and Growth, a European Perspective. TITRA has worked with Ministry of Foreign Affairs, EBRD, and the Taiwan Office for EBRD Business Development for many years in order to promote business and investment. In EBRD countries of operations, since the establishment of Taiwan Office for EBRD Business Development in the year 2007, TITRA has helped materialize over 1 million euro in procurement projects and recruit more than 100 Taiwan experts to participate in TAM program. We also endeavored to promote business opportunities in EBRD countries of operations by organizing TFP, procurement and consultancy contract workshops, seminars, and a business forum. With all the effort, I am pleased to observe from today's event that more and more Taiwanese corporations are interested in and seeking more business opportunities in the region. Taiwan has worldwide recognized successful and vigorous SME, small and medium enterprise, in different industries. And we are very willing to share our successful experience with international community, especially EBRD countries of operations. Therefore, I believe that Taiwan, in no doubt, can be an excellent partner to EBRD in many aspects, such as ICT industry, SME development, sustainable energy applications, and microfinance services, and much more. TITRA will continue to support and provide service to corporations interested in this region, not only through our headquarters staff at Taipei, but also from our 9 offices in EBRD countries of operations, including Kazakhstan, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, and a London Center representative. Therefore, if there is any service that TITRA can provide, we are more than willing to offer in prompt time. With that, I will now turn the floor over to our honorable moderator, President Zhang Xiulian, President of Bank of Taiwan, to elaborate more details regarding today's speech. Before that, I would also like to express my best wishes to the development of EBRD and the prosperity of all participants today. And again, thank you very much for attending today's event. Thank you.
谢谢赵秘书长。接着，让我们邀请今天活动的引言人台湾银行张秀莲董事长来为我们说几句话。欢迎张董事长。
President Zhao of TITRA, Dr. Thomas Miro, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm very pleased and honored to be here for this outstanding speech and to be serving as a moderator. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the EBRD. And our Ministry of Foreign Affairs has specially invited EBRD President Dr. Thomas Miro to lead a delegation to visit Taiwan. President Miro will be deliver a speech here today, and it is the only speech that he will give on this trip in Taiwan. I would like to start by extending my warm welcome to President Miro and his delegation. Since his foundation in 1991, the EBRD has provided more than 30 billion euros in capital and investment to spur transition to market economies and democracy in 29 countries in Central Europe and Central Asia. And through his investment cooperation project with member countries, it has helped state-run enterprises in recipient nations to transform themselves, and has spurred support and has supported the development of small and medium-sized enterprises. And more importantly, it has helped to raise the standard of living in the region. Europe is currently Taiwan's 4th largest export market and the 4th largest source of our imports, a clear indication of the close tie between Taiwan and Europe. However, as January 31st this year, Europe only accounted for 1.9% of all Taiwan's outward investment. Most of our investment in Europe are concentrated in computer, electronics, and optical goods manufacturing, wholesale and retail operations, and financial and insurance sectors. Taiwanese banks have a total of 10 business units in Europe. which is only 3.8% of the 258 overseas business units that Taiwanese banks have established all around the world. Our financial industry could achieve greater global balance in their overseas operations and diversify their market risk by investing more in Europe. Economies throughout the world began bounce back in 2010 from a global financial crisis, but the degree of improvement in developed economies, mainly the United States, Europe, and Japan, has been limited due to continuing economic programs. Relatively speaking, economic growth has been faster in emerging markets, of which China and India are the leading examples. Hard money has been pouring into these countries, but this has triggered asset bubbles as well as growing inflationary pressure. In the IMF World Economic Outlook update published recently, the forecast for world output growth in 2011 was revised upward from 4.2% to 4.4%. But report also warned that a two-speed recovery, where growth in advanced economies is outpaced by growth in emerging economies, could lead to a further round of global financial instability over the coming 2 years. We do not yet know how badly the world economy will be affected by global economic and financial instability, imbalance, by heightened political and economic uncertainty in the Middle East, and by the tsunami and the nuclear accident triggered by the largest recorded earthquake on March 11 hit Japan. At a time like this, with the business world trying to figure out rapidly changing and unpredictable markets, we are very lucky today to have Dr. Thomas Miro as our keynote speaker to share his thoughts with us. Dr. Miro is a man of formidable expertise and experience. In addition to his native German, he can speak very fluent English and French, and has held many important posts, including state minister and head of chancellery in several different functions in Hamburg, senior advisors to Ernst & Young, and advisor to the Warburg Bank. In 2004, he became a member of the European Commission's high-level group on the Lisbon strategy. In 2005, he was named the personal representative of the Federal Chancellor for the Lisbon strategy and the Director General for Economic Policy in the Federal Chancellery, and since November 2005, became the State Secretary in the Federal Minister of Finance. In May 2008, he was nominated as the President of the EBRD. Today, he will be taking the European perspective in analyzing commodity prices, acute financial instability, and the spiraling cost of capital, which are issues that face all the world's economic blocks in the post-financial crisis landscape. He will also be talking about the significant differences among them in terms of economic growth potential and the possible adoption of financial austerity measures. In his speech, he will focus especially on European issues, including the increase in sovereign debt, the excess in global liquidity, and the financial structural reform that are needed in EU in order to lower the risk of capital inflows and enhance the competitiveness of European economies. I'm confident that his analysis and views will be the most direct and complete source of information for our enterprises that plan to embark upon European markets or have already done so. And I dare to say that his speech will also serve a valuable reference for Taiwan enterprise working to deploy global business strategies. Now, let's have a big round of applause for welcome Dr. Thomas Miro to deliver his speech.
Thank you, Chairperson Zhang, for the excellent introduction. Now, let's welcome Dr. Thomas Miro, President of European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, to give us the speech of the road to economic stability and growth, a European perspective.
Dear President of TAITFA, dear Madam Chang, thank you very much indeed, not only for the very meaningful and very kind introductions, but also for hosting us here, and be sure that we will always cherish these moments as they add to the impression of an outstanding hospitality we have enjoyed so far in this country. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me the opportunity to address this distinguished audience here today. It is a special pleasure to be speaking in Taiwan, a country with an impressive economic performance from which others around the world can learn, and especially many countries of operation of EBRD. The financial crisis of 2007 to 2009 has been a pivotal event for many of us. Books will be written about the crisis for many years, but it seems clear that at its origin were loose monetary policies, global macroeconomic imbalances, and weak financial supervision. When credit markets went bust, a local U.S. crisis fund, a local U.S. crisis turned into a global crisis because financial regulatory frameworks had not kept pace with the complexities of the globalization of finance and financial innovation. Countries large and small, commodity exporters and commodity importers, and as far removed from the crisis as Germany, Estonia, Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, or Taiwan, all suffered output declines in 2009, to name but a handful. Containing the global recession required an enormous coordinated policy effort. The G20 framework proved valuable and effective, and it was a demonstration of how the weights in the global economy have shifted towards the emerging markets. The focus in the short term was understandably on stimulating demand by giving a fiscal and monetary boost while work to address the structural causes of the crisis has been moving more slowly. The result is that today the global economy appears to be getting back on track, but it continues to face structural vulnerabilities which are being compounded by and maybe partly causing commodity and food price volatility, and we have added some serious dilemmas. First, in many countries there has been a very significant increase in public debt. Public sectors are now forced to consolidate, often quickly and severely. Growth can come only from the private sector. Secondly, stimulus policies have created abundant global liquidity, which is causing problems particularly in emerging markets, including pressure on exchange rates, inflation, and renewed credit booms. Ironically, despite this liquidity, there is a lack of long-term investment capital, since it is being sucked up by public borrowers while the needs, especially in emerging markets, are enormous. And thirdly, there is still important unfinished business in fixing those flaws in financial systems that contributed to causing the crisis. At the same time, financial institutions have been arguing loudly that regulatory reform would damage growth prospects. The risk I see is that the world economy will again build up macroeconomic tensions and financial sector distortions. But if crisis strikes once more, we will no longer have the necessary fiscal space to deal with it effectively. I would speak about each of the three dilemmas in turn, but I would spend a little more time on the problem of debt, since that is the one most acutely felt in Europe. In large parts of Europe, sovereign debt is arguably now the most damaging direct legacy of the crisis. It is constraining the recovery and placing a disproportionate burden on monetary policy. Sovereign debt problems were at the core of a second wave of instability in 2010. This wave put the Eurozone under serious pressure and was contained only through extraordinary last-minute crisis management. While the focus has been on national sovereign debt, it would be wrong to reduce the problem in this way. Why so? First, because in some countries, such as Eastern Europe, where the EBRD operates, and countries on the Eurozone periphery, such as Ireland and Spain, it is private debt that proved unsustainable. When the crisis struck, governments were forced to intervene and private debt became public debt. In Ireland, a large portion of the bad loans incurred by private banks have been effectively nationalized, leading to an estimated jump in the public debt by about 45% of GDP. Secondly, because Eurozone membership turned national debt problems into a severe test of the European institutions. During the period of expansion, the perception of the capital markets was that membership in the Eurozone, and indeed the EU, represented an implicit financial safety net for individual members, despite assurances of the contrary. That lowered borrowing costs very significantly and contributed to the rapid build-up in debt. When Greece and then Ireland came under pressure, the markets called the Eurozone's bluff, and after much political soul-searching, both countries received liquidity support from European and international institutions. The European Financial Stability Fund was created for this purpose, but liquidity was also provided by the European Central Bank. What is to be done? Governments must reduce debt, and they must reduce incentives to engage in excessive borrowing, whether at public or private level. Regardless of the origin of national balance sheet problems, some degree of fiscal consolidation is part of the solution. And most European governments are now actively working to close fiscal gaps. This acknowledges the pressures exerted by financial markets, but even more importantly, it acknowledges that the build-up in public debt undermines consumer and investor confidence. Austerity in the UK has been well publicized, but action has been even more dramatic in the crisis countries. Greece has been attempting to regain solvency through a very tough combination of expenditure cuts and public revenue increases supported by structural reforms. Many other European countries, including Portugal, Spain, the Baltic countries, Romania, and other countries in Eastern Europe, have been undertaking similar austerity measures and reforms to repay debts incurred before the crisis and return to growth in the medium term. But while fiscal action is important, Europe must also look at the deeper reasons that allowed excessive debt to build up in the first place, and that then turned the debt problems of a handful of small countries in the Eurozone periphery into a threat for the Eurozone as a whole. How did some countries and Europe as a whole get so close to the brink? I believe the answer to this question also holds important lessons for other regions of the world, such as East Asia, that are discussing the introduction of regional financial safety nets. Fundamentally, the answer is that monetary union calls for a degree of fiscal union, and economic union requires some convergence in competitiveness. Before the crisis, Europe had not mustered the political will to spell this out fully. As a result, it lacked crisis mechanisms that would govern the necessary fiscal transfers between countries, and even more importantly, it lacked fiscal and economic disciplines for countries once they were members of the EU and the Eurozone. What is Europe doing to address these problems? First, in late March, the EU agreed on a crisis lending fund, the European Stability Mechanism, ESM, which as of 2013 will be able to provide up to 500 billion euro to EU countries that run into financing difficulties and need time to restore the health of their public finances before returning to capital markets. This ESM extends and makes permanent the European Financial Stability Facility, EFSF, which was created last year. Importantly, support under the ESM is conditional and not intended for countries with unsustainable debt problems. For those countries, sovereign debt restructuring will be encouraged based on bond contracts that make such restructuring easier and that will be introduced into all future European sovereign debt issues. Second, an attempt is underway based on the report of a task force on economic governance chaired by the President of the European Council to strengthen EU rules governing the conduct of economic policies. A few weeks ago, the European Council, that is the Council of the Heads of State and Government, agreed on a package of draft regulations which still need to be negotiated and agreed by the European Parliament, aimed both at strengthening the enforcement of rules that require EU countries to avoid excessive debt and deficits, and expanding these rules beyond the traditional fiscal area. This includes requiring countries to correct not only fiscal imbalances, but also general macroeconomic imbalances, including external imbalances. And thirdly, structural reforms are underway in many European countries. Reforms in Latvia, Greece, Ireland, Romania, and several other European countries have been initiated as part of crisis program. In other countries, reforms are supported by international institutions in a post-crisis context. One example is the work undertaken by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in Eastern Europe in areas such as infrastructure, financial institutions, and energy efficiency. These are, we think, promising initiatives, even though a lot remains to be done to implement them and to make them credible and enforceable. I also believe that more is required to develop common frameworks for competitiveness. That is because of the need to mitigate the tensions that come from divergence in competitiveness within an economic union, and also because Europe must find drivers of growth as it faces difficult demographic trends that will further exacerbate its debt problems. Where does competitiveness come from? Exchange rate policies play a role, but more importantly, the answer is to be found in skills, innovation, labor markets, and the business environment. The EU's so-called Lisbon agenda recognized that competitiveness is central to European growth and the sustainability of monetary union. Reforms have paid some dividends, but altogether there has been a lack of urgency and determination. Germany and France have recently attempted to define an EU consensus on the desirable structural elements of European economies, but this is proving a very difficult task. normally Europe waits and calls upon France and Germany to take the lead, but if the two take the lead, not everybody is satisfied either. These are my thoughts on the debt dilemmas facing Europe, but not Europe alone in the aftermath of the crisis. They are wide-ranging because debt actually crystallizes a set of much deeper international challenges. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, there are two further important dilemmas: the overabundance in global liquidity and unfinished business in reforming financial systems, to which I now will turn briefly. Global liquidity is boosting short-term capital inflows, especially in emerging markets outside Europe, and causing upward pressure on exchange rates, as well as renewed signs of overheating in some property and other asset markets only a year or two after the deepest financial crisis in a generation. What is the source of that liquidity? It is most directly explained by the low interest rates and quantitative easing that the United States and other advanced countries have adopted in response to the crisis. It is also associated with global external imbalances, including the large capital exports from Asia and the commodity-producing countries. While the liquidity may be partly cyclical, it shares many features with the constellation that we saw in the period of financial excess between 2005 and 2007. At present, these large and potentially destabilizing capital flows cause the most difficulties for economic management in the emerging economies, but depending on policy reactions, they could become a renewed source of stress for the global economy as a whole. These concerns formed a prominent part of the Korean G20 presidency in 2010. In the run-up to the 2011 French presidency, many ideas were floated about reforming the international monetary system. These contributions pointed to the deficiencies of the present system, including the dependence on a key reserve currency, an inability to provide incentives for surplus countries to adjust, a disregard for spillover effects of national monetary policies, the costly reliance on self-insurance through reserve accumulation on the part of emerging countries, and significant real exchange rate misalignments, sometimes leading to what some call currency wars. Agreement on some parts of this agenda, such as exchange rates and disciplines on national monetary policies, will be difficult to reach, as we have already witnessed. Others, such as an agreed framework for capital controls and the strengthening of regional financial safety nets so that countries do not have to self-insure, may be more realistic objectives. Asian financial authorities understand the risks of destabilizing capital flows well, and they have adopted a variety of policy measures to manage them, including prudent fiscal policies and selective capital inflow controls. The defense of currencies through sterilized intervention is proving more problematic, because it stokes inflation and gives rise to charges of unfair export practices. When economies are highly interdependent, collective action, including on exchange rates, may be more productive than nationally uncoordinated policies. For instance, collective currency appreciation would spread the adjustment costs across Asia, thus minimizing and balancing the costs from the perspective of individual economies. But this is a discussion that you are much more familiar with than I, so let me not dwell on it. The final dilemma relates to the unfinished reform of national and global financial systems at a time when financial lobbies argue that determined regulation, such as the enforcement of new capital requirements, could kill the sector's contribution to recovery. I'm not convinced by that argument, and I believe that reform is necessary and urgent if we want to avoid a repeat of past mistakes, although of course it has to be well designed. For example, it needs to take account of the specific circumstances of financial sectors in emerging markets. The past 2 years have brought some significant achievements. In the United States, the Dodd-Frank Act introduced changes that are far from marginal, and most of its implementing rules are in the process of being completed. In the European Union, crisis resolution and financial legislation have been generally slower, but nevertheless Europe has agreed on a sweeping set of financial sector reforms. At the center of these reforms are 3 EU-level supervisory agencies and a new European Systemic Risk Board, which is meant to watch out for financial stability risks, such as excessive credit growth or links across the various financial sectors. Capital requirements are being substantially increased, with the SWIFT authorities taking particular leadership. Authorities are also improving their ability to understand and monitor financial systems, including through the collection of relevant data. Even so, the measures adopted so far stop short of an adequate global policy response to the unprecedented shock of the crisis and the chain reactions it triggered. First, we still do not know how to wind down systematically important financial institutions when they become insolvent, particularly when these institutions have assets in many countries well known under the headline of too big to fail. The attempt to allow one such institution, Lehman Brothers, to go bankrupt was, as you all know, the trigger for the global escalation of the financial crisis in September of 2008. The Financial Stability Board carries the discussion about such institutions at the global level, but no obvious solution is in sight yet. Second, there is a need to preserve the benefits of global financial integration, but this will require more global consistency in the regulation of capital markets. The unfinished saga of international accounting standards harmonization illustrates how difficult such an effort can be. And third, and perhaps most fundamentally, there must be more competition in financial systems to deliver better and economically more productive financial services. In emerging markets, the overall provision of credit is generally insufficient and inefficient. In more advanced economies, credit is typically not directed to the borrowers that could make the best use of it, especially high-growth companies with no physical collateral to pledge. Financial stability concerns must be addressed without repressing useful financial development. All three of these concerns involve competition policy, which is generally being underdeveloped in finance compared to other industries. And financial reform is somewhat unpredictable because politicians will feel a need to be responsive to public opinion, which wants the financial sector to pay a price for the crisis. Matters are further complicated by the geographical boundaries of institutions and reforms. For example, in Europe, the new agencies will serve only EU countries. This means that their scope remains much narrower than the scope of actual financial integration in Europe, which extends far outside the European Union. As a result, we will continue to need informal coordination mechanisms, such as the so-called Vienna Initiative, which was promoted by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and successfully used to coordinate cross-border banking groups and home and host country supervisory institutions during the crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, let me come to a close. It is clear that much work remains to be done. In the Eurozone context, this includes strengthening the current blueprints for new or improved institutions and giving new impetus to structural reform in order to both create favorable conditions for private sector growth and to make this growth safer. It is here where our institution, the EBRD, hopes to make an important contribution by strengthening the private sector, improving the business environment, and developing deeper and safer financial markets. The shock of global crisis has triggered a serious search for solutions. In some areas, impressive progress is being made. In others, very little progress has been achieved. The search must continue and may not end anytime soon, if ever. But, and allow me here to paraphrase Confucius, perhaps our willingness to continue searching and not to forget the lessons from the last or previous crises will turn out more important for preventing the next one than the most perfect institutional design. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Dr. Miro. Dr. Miro, please have a seat on the sofa. And now let's welcome Chairman Person Zhang to return to the stage for the dialogue and Q&A section.
We still have a half an hour. After listening to the excellent speech of Dr. Miro, I think everybody understands the problems that has been facing by countries all over the world after the financial crisis of 2008. And there are some dilemmas just mentioned by Dr. Miro that many efforts by G20 and other groups try to figure out some solutions, but up to now, it still have not found the best solution, and many reform should continue to have to prevent the crisis coming again. I think our audience maybe have some questions or comments. Now I'd like to open the floor for discussion. Anybody have questions to Dr. Miro? Please.
So congratulations for your excellent speech. But as you mentioned, some European countries suffered by the financial tsunami. Do you think only relied on financial tool can solve their problem? Because, as you mentioned, do you think this country can recover their competitiveness in the near future? Do you think? Thank you.
Well, this is indeed the crucial question. Probably looking at the 4 countries that are looked at most critically, they, each and every one, are in a very different situation. Speaking of Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain. Ireland has not a competitiveness issue, but has a banking crisis. And as soon as the banking crisis would be resolved, I'm quite confident that with the advantages Ireland has to offer, they will again be able to recover, even though the balance sheet problems of their banks are really huge as compared to their GDP. I would also be very optimistic with regard to Spain. I think that Spain has a layer of very competitive companies. They have a strong position in many Latin American countries, so they have also possibilities to develop outside of Spain. And they have entered into a mode of really addressing their weaknesses like labor market and the situation of a certain layer of their banks, the so-called cajas. The situation in Greece and Portugal is certainly different from that. Greece being in the most serious situation, and indeed I think for Greece to, on one hand, cope with this very high level of debt and at the same time develop a more competitive economy will be very difficult. My personal opinion is that Greece should enter into discussions about how to restructure that debt, because otherwise the burden would be too too strong and too heavy on their shoulders. Portugal is certainly in a better situation than Greece is, but Portugal has a competitiveness issue. They have not the same kind of competitive companies like Spain, and they have to some degree thought they would be more competitive than they really are, because they have profited a lot of EU structural funds that have improved the infrastructure of the country, but indeed have probably created some false expectations. So the situation the countries are in, these four countries are in, are quite different from each other, but I totally agree with you. The debt problem in most of the cases is not the source, is not the origin of the problems, but more or less mirroring the situation of the real economy.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you, Dr. Miros, for your remarkable lecture and very clearly explained the sovereign debt crisis explored last years. My minor question is that how to face the challenge of the most current events, that Japan suffered a massive earthquake, tsunami, and potential of nuclear power plants meltdown. What will be the impact in the short term and long run, and how to dispose those issues, and how are we adjusting so that we can sustain the stability and the growth? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I think one can only pay tribute to the way the people of Japan has reacted to this event in a admirable and very mature way. Of course, the tsunami and the earthquake are terrible events, with all the fatalities that they have incurred on the population. In economic terms, I think Japan will be able to cope with it quite quickly. I think the Japanese economy and the Japanese corporate sector is quite able to deal with it. The problem of the nuclear power plant is much more difficult to assess because we still don't know the end of the story. As ebrd, we have some experience because we are taking care of the G8 fund for Chernobyl, the nuclear power plant in Ukraine, which exploded quite exactly 25 years ago. So we know how expensive it is to address such a problem. Now a new confinement will be built, but it is the first of its kind, and it was a very long way to design it in a proper way. So this is a certainly very difficult and challenging problem, and in Japan it's not only the problem of the site itself, but it's close to the sea. It is an area which is bound to earthquakes. So resolving that problem will be very challenging indeed. But all in all, I would tend to think that the macroeconomic impact will not be too severe, that the global recovery will not be endangered by the events in Japan.
Concern the Japanese earthquake and the nuclear problem recently, we have seen many anti-nuclear power action in many countries. Do you think it will have an impact for the economic growth or the structure of power supply in the future?
Well, what we have seen so far is that nations have reacted very differently to the events, even neighboring nations. If you look at Europe and take France and Germany, Germany had put immediately to a halt 7 of its 17 nuclear power plants, whereas France more or less has not undertaken any additional effort or has not decided on any additional measures. So nations have reacted to it differently. But what I would think is that the appetite for new nuclear power plants in many countries will be affected. We all know that these kind of investments are extremely capital intensive, are very costly, so any investor needs to be very reliant on the regulatory fundaments of his investments. And my sense is that in many countries and with many investors, people will think twice whether the risk of investing into a technology which can be so quickly affected by events somewhere in the world is the right thing to do. This is a change in terms of doing business. I mean, if we have an event like Fukushima, it is reported about throughout the whole world. The whole world follows the events in real time. And so far,